prayers are just formalities for our food or whatever. But have you ever had a time when you just talk to God? And this was one of those times where it was a conversation more than what sometimes we think of as prayer. Which I think is what prayer should be all about. But sometimes we get it in habits. This was not an individual prayer. It was a recognition on my part that maybe I've had a calling beyond being a teacher and being a mathematician or a statistician. And I remember weeping and telling God that I was willing. And I think that's one of the last memories to go in the rest on Sunday for me. Because it was so real and it was so powerful. Now, I know that the atheists in the world would say I was just having an emotional episode, but I believe it was more than that. So I came to the end of my graduate studies. I interviewed at La Sierra University, which was then part of Loma Linda campus. And at about the same time, I got a call to go to Andrews and spend a couple more years in graduate school. And I decided to go ahead and teach mathematics. So I went to La Sierra, and I think I mentioned last time I got involved doing their prayer meeting. Their prayer meeting was very small. It's one of those sad things, big church, very small prayer meeting. People, at least a lot of people still came to Sabbath school. I taught a Sabbath school class, so I was very involved in the church, but not in a professional way. We promised them 5 years. I think they thought that, we'd work our way in and stay there forever, but got an offer to teach at PUC, and when you compare Angwin to Riverside, California loses every time in my book. Traffic from here to here, smog from here to here, congestion, all of the things that you think of when you think of Southern California. So we did move to Pacific Union College. Found out something interesting, though. La Sierra was much easier to break into and make friends. PUC was kind of this closed subculture. But it wasn't long before I was teaching a Sabbath school class in the PUC church and continuing to be involved, but just being a math stat teacher. But in, I'm going to think it was about 1994. In the summer of 1994, one of my best friends at PUC was Greg King. You might have heard that name. His wife is the daughter of HMS Richards Jr. And Greg was a good friend of mine. We did a lot of things together. And he knew something of my past history in ministry. So the church in Clear Lake, California, which you know Clear Lake, right? About 58 miles north of here in the ignominious Lake County. I know some of entering Lake County, they have those signs. Somebody spray painted an F in front of Lake. Entering Flake County. So anyway, they had an opening in the church at the church in Clear Lake, and Greg King called the conference and said, I have this friend who teaches math who could probably pastor that church. And so they called me. They were kind of desperate at the conference because the Clear Lake church was angry. You go a year without a pastor, and they were mad. And it's really hard when you have a church where maybe 40 people attend to cook up a church service every week and have local elders preach and so on and so on. So may have been threatening to quit paying tithe. And let me tell you, that gets the conference's attention. And so I don't recommend that, by the way. Tithe is not optional, but they were mad. So they interviewed me and they said, sure, you take it. And they told me this. The conference president told me this, and and I'm not going to tell you who the conference president was, because this thing he told me makes me mad to this day. He said, this is a maintenance church. What does that mean? It means it's not going to grow. It's going down. They're all old. Just try to maintain it until everybody dies off. Well, folks, if a church isn't alive and growing, it is going to die. And to label a church a maintenance church really upset me. The other thing he asked me was, how are you at funerals? Can you do funerals? So I'm like, oh, you got to be kidding me. This is no attitude to take towards church. They had a little church school. They had 6 students. And the second, I think it was the second board meeting where I was pastor there, they were bringing a motion to close the school. And had a very charismatic head elder, a good man, but a very good leader, and he had everybody's attention. And I was still not 40 yet. I was in my 30s, young, and, a math teacher. So we kind of had a little bit of I don't want to call it a shootout, but we had a serious disagreement. Because he said, this is sucking our church dry of money. This is it's not worth it. We've only got 5, 6 kids. And I said, you close that school, you're going to eventually close this church. And thank the Lord, they voted to keep the school. So I was there 9.5 years. The church grew. And we eventually had a 2-room school. We eventually were at capacity, which was 35 students, 2 teachers. And I'm not bragging here, folks. This is the Lord, okay? This is the Lord. But I do believe the Lord used my attitude and that I had the right attitude. And that is, no, this is not a maintenance church. It's a church. And we had, as I may have said before, we had students, their parents, and in many cases, their grandparents were raising the kids. We have a new sound system. They're playing with it. I can tell you exactly what's happening. They're learning the system on the fly. So if I sound a little ringy, they'll figure that out. So anyway, we had 2 teachers. We had every desk full. We had people crying to get their kids into the school because the public school, starting in middle school, had armed police on campus in Clear Lake because there was so many drugs, there was so much violence among the students, 7th graders. So people wanted their kids in our school because we had strict discipline. We had safety on our campus. And anyway, the school did not go broke. The church did not go broke. We did have one interesting board meeting, one of the first ones, where I shared the auditor's statement on our finances. And I found out from that statement that we had $125,000 in savings in that church. Now, we're talking a small church, very, very small when I got there. And so I gave the auditor's report to the board, and the treasurer wasn't able to be there that night, the wife of the charismatic head elder. She called me that night, foaming at the mouth mad. She said, I hear you told them about the money. And I said, well, the letter said, please share this with your board. She said, I don't care what the conference said. If you tell them, they will not give anymore. And I said, if that's the only reason they're giving, we have to address the problem. Well, of course, they kept giving. Then we came a few years later. I said, we need to do some evangelism. Lake County is much better for evangelism than Yountville, to tell you the truth. Did you know that it's easier to reach total heathens than it is self-satisfied people? I found this church very challenging. We brought someone in and we sent out the flyers and we got 4 people or whatever. It's just crazy here. Everybody thinks they already know the way to paradise. Anyway, well, the elder and the treasurer said, we don't have the money to do evangelism. And I said, now, wait a minute. We all know how much money we have. Oh, but we're keeping it for a rainy day, they said. Why am I telling you this? Well, it's part of my experience. It's part of what's made me who I am today. We had the evangelism. We did Mark Finley's Net 98. Any of you remember that? We must have baptized close to 15 people. Now, they didn't all stay. You know how that goes. But it was well worth the money we spent, which was minimal. It was to install a satellite dish. It was no biggie. Well, that head elder became a very dear friend, and his wife too, by the way. Well, then after 9.5 years, a sad story came to be. The conference, well, the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists had just voted in a new pay scale. And the pay scale was, at that point in time, tied to cost of living in a new way. Meaning if you are a pastor in San Francisco, you would get paid a lot more than a pastor in Georgia, just to pick a low-income place and a high-income place. Or if you were a pastor in Manhattan, you would get the top pay, and it's considerably more than you would get somewhere else, like double or more. So, and it's so that you can afford housing. So the Northern California Conference did an interesting thing. They let go all of the part-time pastors. I was a stipend pastor teaching full-time at PUC. So they let go of all the stipend pastors so that they could take that money to up the pay of the full-timers. But that meant they had to take the church I was pastoring and make it part of a district. It didn't end well. The 2 churches in the district kind of went down. They both had church schools. So this poor pastor that followed me had to have 2 church schools, 2 churches, had to be driving 25 miles or 20 miles between them. This happened all over the conference. It was a difficult experience, and I'm going to tell you this for a reason. And I hate how fast time goes. The conference called me and they said, George, we need you to carry out our wishes on this. We need you to tell the church that we're going to have a business meeting. You know, that's not a board, that's where the whole church is invited. And the reason for this business meeting is that we're going to let you go. But you must not tell the people what the business meeting is about. Okay? They didn't want them prepared. When you've been pastor for 9.5 years, you really have relationships with people. It's not just, you know, musical pastors is not necessarily going to go down well. So they said, don't tell them. So I did. I announced and we put it in the bulletin, and I even got up and talked about it. You know, the conference president and secretary are going to come. We're going to have this special board meeting, and I made it sound like it was, you know, candy. It's going to be great. They came and they announced it, and the church started weeping. I started weeping. My wife started weeping. I had people that had never been to church in that 9.5 years show up. I don't even know who they were. And they got up and shooed the conference president out. True story. Complete strangers, but apparently members that weren't coming. And after the meeting, that head elder came up and said, George, I thought they were going to ordain you or something. You lied so well. So anyway, so there I was without a church. And I don't feel good without a church. That's one reason I don't want to retire, because I just love what I do. And you can turn that music off. Thank you. So then I decided to help the pastor that got the two churches. So for a while I was still preaching at one or the other of them to help him out. But then the pastor at Vallejo Central Church got sick, and I did a year there as an interim pastor. Well, I guess I have to quit, but what's that? No, the pastor's okay if I keep talking. What's that? Okay, keep on keeping on. So then that one, by the way, I was promised a ministerial license when I took Clear Lake. But then the ministerial secretary moved to the Oregon conference, and the people who were there replacing him said, "We don't know anything about that promise." So I did that without any credentialing for 9.5 years. I eventually, don't tell the conference I said this, but I eventually started baptizing and marrying people and just said, "Phooey," on trying to call someone else in. So I did that. At first, they wanted me to have an ordained minister in the tank with me to baptize. Then they said, "Well, if he's sitting in the front row, that's good enough." This is true. This is true. And eventually I said, "You guys are a little bit off. I'm just going to do what I need to do. You sent me here as a pastor. I'm going to be a pastor." So then Vallejo for a year. And the conference president at that time promised me a church, either Vallejo or another one, depending on how things turned out. But then he got moved up to the union, and he called me and said, "I can't keep my promises because I'm a lame duck." I want you to know this, not because I'm angry with the conference, but I want you to know you can't base your Christianity on how you're treated. This is part of my testimony. You can't say, "Well, they didn't keep their promise, therefore I'm mad and I'm not going to be an Adventist or I'm not going to be a pastor." God is calling me, not conference presidents. So I've basically tried to never let that bother me. So they said, "We're going to have to fill this pulpit with a full-time person." Meanwhile, I got a call to go to Texas to be the vice president for spiritual development for the Southwestern Adventist University. And I took that because I had this rule: if I got a call, that I take it. Plus the fact the conference had said they were going to fill the Vallejo pulpit. I found out after I left that they probably would have left me there part-time. Saves money, right? In Vallejo indefinitely. And I felt kind of bad because I loved the Vallejo church. It was a perfect fit. But anyway, 3 years in Texas, and because I was in a spiritual leadership position, I was ordained there. And then, of course, I went to Canada for 5 years, and then I came here, and it's over 8 years here. So what's the moral of this story? Follow God. Follow God. Don't worry about what people think about you. Worry about what God thinks of you. Be willing. Be willing. If you're called to do something and you say, "Lord, this is crazy," that's double indication that it probably is the Lord. Because he has a sense of humor. And he knows the gifts he's given you. You don't necessarily know the gifts he's given you. I'll end by saying this. I'll never forget the first class I taught. at Oklahoma State University. I was 22 years old. I looked exactly like the students. I had 45 trigonometry students. I had never had trigonometry. I had about three or 4 weeks of a pre-calculus course that was trig, but it was very abbreviated. I was scared to death. And I was at home. And I was telling my wife, I can't do it. And she said, wipe your tears, shut up, teach, or we don't eat. Very clear message. So I went and taught that class. And by halfway through that semester, I realized I had a gift. I didn't know it. I had a gift for teaching. The class went well. The students respected me. I had order in the class. They learned. It was awesome. But I want to tell you that to this day, I know why it was awesome. Because I was so scared, and it took some time for that fear to dissipate. I prayed outside the classroom door every single day. And I've been doing that since. Every time I get up for a sermon, you may see me bowed with my head and my lips moving. I am not insane. I am praying. To God be the glory. Great things he has done, not just in my life, but in everyone who listens to him.